A retired Maine professor has poured a lifetime of experiences, research, and stories from both sides of the Atlantic into his first novel. The name of the book is Murky Overhead, and it's a work of historical fiction.
It tells the story of a day in the life of one family of Irish immigrants, the Folans. 207's Beth McAvoy spoke with the author Michael Connolly from his home on Munjoy Hill in Portland, which also happens to be the setting for the story.
Murky Overhead takes a look at one family, an Irish immigrant family, who've been in Portland, Maine for about 20 years by the turn of the 20th century. So all the action takes place on one day, which is January 31st, 1900. What goes on in one day is probably more than could be fit in a whole year, but for the sake of the novel, it's very action-packed.
As a professor of history and political science, you have done your fair share of writing, but this is your first novel. What made you want to venture into the world of novels?
When you write academic works, which I've done, I have 3 books published, which are academic, the readership is very limited. Other professors like to read that, and maybe specialists in whatever their area would like to read that. But I wanted to write something that the general readership of Portland especially, but also Irish America and anybody really interested in the immigration question in America today would be interested in.
Connolly says his whole life has been building to this book.
The episodes that are recorded here are things that I started hearing when I was a child, from my father, from his friends, from neighbors. I lived on Munjoy Hill and grew up and have lived on Munjoy Hill most of my life. But then also studying in Dublin. I was living in Ireland for 3 years, and in particular getting to meet my relatives in County Galway. I picked up so many anecdotes and stories and legends, and then also things like John Ford's films. And I wrote the book over maybe 10 years, and in particular finished it over the pandemic, but I've been writing it my whole life.
Mary Joyce really stuck out to me in your novel. She kind of, her optimism and her strength. Was she influenced by any one particular person in your life?
A lot of Mary Joyce is in my grandmother and my grandmother's story that I have heard so much. But as I've said before, she's not atypical. She would be typical, maybe not 12 or more children or 10 or more children, but maybe 7 or 8. That could be difficult too. 1 or 2 or 3 can be a challenge. So the other part of that is that in my reading of Irish history and immigration, I learned that the Irish sent over more single women than any other immigrant group in the 19th and early 20th century. So these were bold, brave, courageous people who had to learn to get by, in some cases, without family connections.
As much as Murky Overhead is a story about a family, it's also a lot about the place, about Portland, about Munjoy Hill.
This is Munjoy Hill that I remember growing up in the 50s and 60s. It's a little bit different, they tell me today, even the reputation. I mean, in years past, Munjoy Hill would have welcomed people on the 4th of July, but they largely stayed away for the rest of the year, given its reputation of being a so-called tough neighborhood, whatever that was meant to mean. But now, of course, everybody and their uncle and aunt want to move onto Munjoy Hill. So it's a different place. And so I want to have people know what Munjoy Hill and the East End of Portland and Portland as a whole were like when it was a rough scrabble working class town.
Connolly hopes that even people who don't live in Portland or have Irish ancestry will enjoy Murky Overhead.
I really hoped that this would not just specifically be a story about Portland, because I know that the Irish immigrant experience and the immigrant experience in general in America has so many things in common. The title, Murky Overhead, difficulties. It's not the land of milk and honey. The streets weren't paved in gold. And as a famous mayor of Boston once said, not every person's home is a castle. So people had a hard time of it. Mary is about to give birth to her 10th child, and they're living on the income of one dock worker. So people are having a hard time now, and I wanted people to be aware that historically this was the case, and maybe shine a light on that and let people be a little bit more gracious to people who are going through those difficulties today.
Connolly retired from teaching at St. Joseph's College in Standish just a few years ago. He's devoted a lot of his career to studying the history of the Irish in Maine and has worked extensively with the Maine-Irish Heritage Center.
If you're interested in reading Murky Overhead, head to our website or app for more information.